Of course, some additional reference is in order. So I'm going to split my 3D view, and on the left, I'm going to switch to an image editor, click open, and in our reference folder, you'll find CC0 hoodie. So let's take a look at this and discuss the kinds of accents I'm talking about. In a way, I think of clothing structure as dynamic wrinkles and static wrinkles. So the dynamic wrinkles is what we simulated. And static wrinkles are usually from how the clothing is stored. Like if you fold this hoodie and put it on a shelf or in a drawer, over time, the wrinkles that form while in storage will still hold their shape to some degree, even when it's being worn, even on top of the dynamic wrinkles. So if we look at this hoodie here, I'm talking about these small, subtle wrinkles that are going horizontally, they're diagonal, a little bit random, but often they're concentrated a little bit more in the joints of the article of clothing as well. But in a very real sense, they can appear anywhere. And even though this hoodie feels clean and crisp and new, there's still a bunch of these static wrinkles. Here you can see them very clearly. So the simulation does not create these types of wrinkles, and that's where sculpting comes in very handy. So here's one example. I'll also be using this reference for when I'm creating the material, and the fuzziness up here at the top of this image is going to be great reference for that. But in addition to these static wrinkles, let me see if I can find a better example. This one's pretty good. Often around the rim of the hood, you get these crisp creases coming from these seams. All right, you can see them very clearly on the other side, but also along the seams of the shoulder and of the arm. So that's going to be another common type of detail that we can add. Here you can see it, just little pinches kind of emanating out from the seam itself. That adds a lot of realism. Also, you're not going to get that from the simulation unless you sim it at an extremely high polygon count, which I don't think is a practical approach considering time that's needed for that. But here we can see some additional static wrinkles. Oftentimes fairly sharp, they're subtle, but it's very evident how they're emanating horizontally across the chest. Also in the back here, this kind of almost noise pattern crisscrossing the backside. You know, the more of these you add, I think the clothing feels older and worn. So the fewer you add, perhaps the more new it feels. But here's a really crisp one. Look at that. If I put that in my sculpture, it would almost feel unnatural. But I mean, as a photo, you can't really argue with it. And here we don't see quite as many pinches from the seams. So I don't know if it's like cheaper manufacturing that produces those seams or just a particular style, but it seems more form-fitting hoodies don't have as much of this pinching. We're going to be in the middle and definitely add some. Here's a great example. Pretty significant amount of pinching, especially in the hoodie. But I also like this material, this kind of classic sweatshirt material. And then one other detail I will at least try to see how it turns out is the sort of secondary seam, right? So we've added one seam that goes around each of our stitched edges, but there's a secondary one that actually shows the stitching. And I'll show you how we can add that. But it's not on every seam. Like it's around the shoulder, it's around the hoodie. It doesn't seem like it's around this upper seam. Maybe it is. Let's see if there's another example. Not really. Okay, in this one it does have a seam. But we have some flexibility here in the style of hoodie. And this last one, oh, this is a great example of those static wrinkles. Just small little creases, kind of random across the surface. So yeah, with that analysis in our heads, let's begin to add such detail. And let's find, I think this hoodie is going to be a good example as a persistent reference. And for our model, we can get rid of the subdivision surface modifier. And we'll turn off solidify. I think it's going to be turned off anyway once we add the multi-res and jump into sculpt mode. So let's subdivide 3 times. Based on my rehearsal, that should be enough to get all the details we need from the sculpt. And I'll switch over to my pen and tablet. And the first thing I want to do in sculpt mode is grab my crease brush with Shift-C. And I'm going to start with these static wrinkles, or creases. I almost think creases is more intuitive, whereas they're not full-blown wrinkles like this, which we get from the dynamic side of the simulation. And so with the crease brush selected, I'm going to keep it pretty low, like 0.3, maybe 0.2. And we'll adjust the size, but we can be very free with this. Just kind of draw a line pushing out, then hold control, and right on top of it, draw a line pushing in. That's my typical approach. And then maybe shift to smooth out the ends. All right, so push out with a stroke, push in with a stroke right on top of it or right below it. Maybe it's a little bit too strong. Let's go down to like 0.25. And there we go. It's really pretty simple. There's not a rigid structure to pay attention to. And as long as you keep them subtle enough to not detract from the main structure, the dynamic cloth structure, then these should be pretty easy to add. And we'll continue into our sleeve. Again, the approach is push out, push in, kind of one of each. So you can maybe push in first and then push out, but kind of crisscrossing, going diagonal sometimes. And also, I don't want to do a perfectly uniform pass of these static wrinkles. I want to do them in kind of patches. All right, so I hit this patch pretty hard. Maybe I'll skip most of the middle of the chest and then start adding some on the other side, just so that it's not completely uniform. Uniform passes typically look far less realistic than kind of isolated patches. And maybe across the middle over here. It took me a long time to realize this is what clothing does. And like getting the juxtaposition of horizontal static wrinkles perpendicular to the vertical dynamic wrinkles ends up a pretty realistic result. So yeah, I like the way this is turning out. And I also like that it's just not hard. Like oftentimes small detail passes like this can be more difficult than simple. So in something simple, you kind of appreciate it in a different way. It's also good to be reminded that with the knowledge, anybody can do this stuff. It's not just reserved for super gifted artists or anything. I mean, this stuff is super hard as a whole, but when tasks are simple like this, it just reminds me that it's not always rocket science. All right, so I'm going to stop there. Again, I'm going to kind of pursue that type of static wrinkles in patches across the entire hoodie, but I'm just going to overview each part of the accent sculpting process in real time in a small section and then time lapse the entire hoodie. And so the next thing I want to add is the seam creases, the seam pinches. For this, I might increase the strength a little bit, like to 0.4. All right, and here we're just going to push in. And I want to push down hardest right on the seam and then pull off of my pressure as I exit the stroke. All right, so these can be tempting to just do a very consistent pattern all the way down. That's quickest and also least realistic. So you want to be, again, a little bit random, maybe make some longer, some smaller, some clustered together, some connected on both sides of the seam. All right, so once we do a pass of those, I like to go back with my inflate brush and kind of bolster some of those rounding over on one side, and then smooth, commonly smoothing on the very end, so it's not a harsh transition. And let me find some reference, actually. Okay. And then also pushing in the seam itself, because right now the seam is perfectly uniform. But if we kind of push at various spots, it will make the seam less uniform and therefore more believable. And I don't recommend doing this on all the seams. It does only seem to happen in certain areas. Like commonly you get this very ruffled type texture on the secondary seam between the main seam and the stitched seam. And so I'll want to add those once we get to the secondary seam sculpting portion. But yeah, I'm keeping it a little more subtle around here. But it also gives this kind of puffy feel to the fabric material itself. And, you know, it starts to go away from this paper thin 3D mesh, and we get the illusion of a puffy, thick sweatshirt material. So that's the second detail. First we had static wrinkles, then we've got seam pinches, and now let's add the secondary seam itself. So with Shift C, our crease brush, I'm going to enable stabilize stroke, and I'm going to increase the radius to 100. That's going to give me a better chance to keep it straighter than crooked. And let me just do a test. Hold Control. And maybe make it a little bit smaller. Maybe make it a little bit stronger too, like 0.5. Okay. And then I'm going to maximize the viewport and probably do this in smaller sections. But I'm just going to try and cut secondary seam right alongside the main seam. Let's see, maybe it should be a little bit thicker. Let's check our reference. It's definitely thicker here, but it doesn't have one on the shoulder. Yeah, I do feel like maybe it needs to be a little bit thicker. This is also where you can kind of determine the style that you like. Thicker secondary seams give a different feel than thinner ones. Thinner ones usually make the fabric feel thinner. And then we'll just terminate it in a place where it's kind of conspicuous. You know, we don't have to worry about continuing the seam realistically through the armpit because that's never going to be seen. And then I think I will cut another secondary seam on this side. Make sure I'm keeping consistent sizes. And then I will skip over this vertical one. Just for the sake of variety, I'm getting enough of that impression from the reference that I can choose exactly where these seams go. It doesn't have to be universal if I don't want. And this can take some practice, keeping a straight or evenly spaced stroke. So don't be afraid to undo and try again until it's right. And then I think I will add one here. Not quite the right spacing. Now, that is pass one. The second pass of the secondary seam is going to be stitching inside the crease we just cut. And we can easily do this by changing the dash ratio in our stroke options. So if we go from 1 to 0.5, that basically produces a perfect stippled stitch line. Though maybe we don't have enough geometry. We might need to jump up to level 4 for this. Yeah. All right, so let's subdivide. Before I subdivide, let's see. I kind of wish I did this before we started sculpting. And I want to get rid of the shape keys. So let's remove the basis and then cloth. All right, in my rehearsal, I didn't do that, and subdividing the multi-res actually broke the mesh. So now that it's collapsed and doesn't have any shape keys, I think we should be safe in subdividing up one more level. So hopefully you've learned from this course that shape keys and multi-res can be a little finicky together. So it's good to be mindful of that. Now I can add this secondary stitching, but another thing you might notice is that these seams tend to puff out a little bit, or they can, depending on the style. They don't really do it over here as much, but like here in the silhouette, you can clearly see that we have a little bump out. And so we can do that with the inflate brush if we want. Probably it's best to do this before we add the secondary stitch marks, but just puffing that out a bit. It also has a usually helpful side effect of tightening our seams in general as well. Okay, so back to the crease brush and let's add those stitches. Let's do a test. Pop, pop, pop. Nice. Maybe make it a little bit smaller. The stitching seems too broad. Let's see, what if I change the spacing distance to scene instead of view? Let's see, make the dash ratio like 0.6 instead. Or maybe smaller than that. 0.4. Let's see, how about decrease the spacing to like 6? There we go, that's more like it. Keep our brush fairly small, hold Control, and cut right down the center of that first seam line. It gets a little bit unevenly spaced, doesn't it? All right, what if I use my pinch brush and let's see, let's hold off in the X axis. So lock the X and then just pinch a little bit. No, not X, Y, I mean. Right, so I want it to not pinch in this direction. So lock the Y. Okay, there we go. Now it's a little bit more evenly spaced. Back to the Shift C crease brush and make sure to disable the locking and continue cutting our stitches with a small brush. Ooh, got a little away from me there. Let's undo and try that again. You know, I'm okay with it not being perfect. It just feels more realistic when these stitches aren't laser perfect. But you don't want it to be too handmade looking either. Almost got that whole stroke right until the very end. There we go, third time's the charm. And this shoulder is shaping up really nicely. This kind of detail I want to add again to the entire hoodie, but I'll do the rest of it in time-lapse fashion. And let's see, other things to keep in mind. So what happens when we turn on our solidify modifier? Because we were kind of hoping to keep that involved because that would be most convenient. It doesn't turn on in sculpt mode, so when we jump back to object mode, how's it looking? Let's see, turn it off and on. Okay, so it does kind of balloon our shapes up, and it's not exactly what we sculpted, which I don't like. So what's different about the solidify in this case is we can't put it before multi-res. Multi-res has to come first in the stack. And so our solidify is actually pretty sharp. And so I don't think we'll be able to keep solidify involved. It definitely looks better in terms of the details we're adding when it's turned off. And so I think we're going to have to fake the thickness a bit. And really the only place it matters is the hoodie rim itself. So let's get rid of the solidify. We should be able to do this in edit mode. Simple enough. Basically it's going to be a cheat. So let me save a version of my scene first. And then what I want to do is tab into edit mode and basically take this edge loop. Let's see, we can stop it sooner than this. So with my circle select, we'll cut off the selection on the front. We don't need to add the thickness there. Whoops. All right, let's go into local view on this. Okay, that's going to be good. I will Shift D to duplicate this, right click so we don't get any transforms, and then Alt S to push this inward, getting us thickness. Okay, so I pushed that in about negative 0.05 or almost 0.06. Let's make it an even negative 0.06. Okay, and then we can fill, should be pretty intuitively. Whoa, it got really weird over here. I see what happened. I'm gonna have to fix this. It's okay, it shouldn't be a big issue, but just note to self. And then I'm going to have to figure out what this looks like exactly. Okay, so then this should connect just like that. All right, select everything, Shift in to make our normals consistent. Control R. Well, before I do that, let's figure out what's going on over here. Hope I didn't fill the wrong verts. Yeah, what is going on over here? Should have been more careful with my selection. Let's just get rid of these. Yeah, because I'm not exactly sure what even happened there. That should be good enough. Now I will Control R to cut an edge in the center and then Alt S to push that out. That gives us some rounded profile to the thickness we created. Let's cut another edge loop in the center. That border edge, I'm going to push that inward as well. And now in object mode, if we turn on our multi-res modifier, it's the illusion of thickness rather than thickening the entire mesh. And so one thing that's pretty common to hoodies is a very thick secondary seam. And I think it's going to be easier just to add that in the mesh with a bevel operation than it would be to sculpt it, right? Because when you get into the hoodie, you have very extreme folds happening. And so once again, going to select an edge loop, deselect the front edges. And I'm going to stop the selection inside that other seam. right? Okay, just like that. Now I should be able to Control B, increase the segments, Control minus, and then Alt S to push it in. And that should give us a decent secondary seam around the hood. Yeah, much easier to do it here than to sculpt it. Now there is an error right here. There's some penetration that I should fix while I'm in edit mode. And so we can do this pretty easily with proportional editing, connected only. Let's change to smooth. All right, you can see how we can move that up and they will separate because they're far enough away in terms of edge loops. I need to dial in, let's see, maybe select the faces themselves, actually. I'm taking a little bit too much with it. What's it look like on the inside? All right, so that should fix it once we go back to object mode. Yeah, we don't have that penetration anymore. Let's see if there's any other spots like that. Maybe there's too big of a gap here in the hoodie. So like selecting kind of a zigzag string of verts, turn on proportional editing again, Alt S, and push those out. Because this was too skinny, but it's going to be too hard to push those together in sculpt mode. Should be easier to do that here in edit mode. All right, that's a little bit better. Not so much of an unnatural gap. Let's see, I think our mesh is good to go back to sculpt mode. Grab my pen and tablet once again. And any new geometry we added typically comes in as a face set. Let's just go to our face set menu and face set from visible. Since everything visible, it will clear that out. All right, so here's something I need to fix. We'll use, instead of the crease brush, we'll use draw sharp, which just doesn't have the pinching. We'll kind of push that back in, maybe smooth it out. Just kind of an unwanted error there, or seam shape that we can fix easy enough. Smoothing and then pushing it back in. All right, I'm going to plump up the secondary seam around the hoodie. They're typically pretty puffy. Also might need to smooth some things out. It looks like we do have some other intersection in here. I think this is from the secondary seam that we modeled. See if we can just hide it and kind of get away with it. Yeah, okay, that's good enough. Maybe the inflate brush can be used to salvage that as well. Okay. Yeah, so we're getting more to that, you know, puffier feel to the hoodie. I'm leaning that way rather than, you know, like a thin fabric, a light hoodie, you might say. This is definitely a winter hoodie. I just think those, I don't know, look more comfortable. I like to wear those more than the other. And let's see, I think at this point I can probably start the time lapse. I don't love how the seam kind of spreads out here, so I'm going to just manually pull that back to the center. And let's leave local view. Let's see what this looks like with our head in play. And let's see. One thing I've noticed the more I've worked with this hoodie is because we cut off the sleeve length and the torso length, I immediately feel like he's too small, like his torso is too small. But, you know, we worked on getting the scale right at the beginning of the simulation, so if we turn our torso collider back on, it feels better. It just is a good reminder that the torso doesn't stop where the clothing stops, but that's just for practicality's sake in this project, knowing that we're only going to focus up here. And even with that said, you know, the hoodie is definitely more form-fitting than it is baggy. But, you know, we could, if we really thought it was too small, we could shift right-click to place our cursor kind of at the middle of the neck. Let's go from the side and do that. And then in the view properties of the in panel, take the location of the cursor to 0. And if we scale from here for our hoodie, you know, maybe that would help. But I'm going to trust that it is properly scaled given the work we put into the simulation. But I do feel like the hood kind of hugs the neck a little too closely. So we can definitely, in sculpt mode, in multi-res, let's turn on sculpt base mesh. So I can make some more broad proportional changes. and we can bring out the hoodie. Also, I feel like it kind of chokes at the front of the neck a little bit. I think the weight of the hoodie pulls it down and therefore the front backward. And so to alleviate that, we can push it forward as well. Just kind of give him a little more breathing room. But at this point, those are all the isolated things I want to do to our hoodie. And from now on, I will time-lapse applying these techniques to the overall surface. So you can watch that if you want, or you're welcome to skip it.